In the last lecture, we wrote our first little Node.js server. Now, this server is not doing all it should do. It's not returning a response, for example, but it's generally showing us how we do create server-side code with Node.js and how we do create our own servers. Now, let's understand what happened there. We executed that file with node app.js because our file was named app.js. And this essentially started the script where Node.js went through the entire file, parsed the code, registered the variables and functions, and so on. So it basically read our entire code and started executing it. But then something important happened. We never left that program, right? The reason for this is an important concept in Node.js called the event loop. This is basically a loop process which is managed by Node.js, which keeps on running as long as there is work to do, you could say. It keeps on running as long as there are event listeners registered. And one event listener we did register, and we never unregistered, is that incoming request listener we passed or we set up with the help of create server. We passed a function to create server, and that is basically an ongoing event listener, one we didn't unregister from. And we shouldn't, because our server should, of course, stay up and running. So our core Node application basically is managed by this event loop. All our code is managed by this. And as I mentioned, Node.js uses such an event-driven approach for all kinds of stuff, not just for managing that server, but that is of course a crucial part, but you will see it a lot throughout this course. For example, when we later access a database, you will see that there we also basically send that please insert some data request, and then we register some function that should be executed once it's done. And Node.js uses this pattern because it actually executes single-threaded JavaScript. So the entire Node process basically uses one thread on our computer it's running on. Now, as you might guess, if we create a server with Node.js, it should of course be able to handle multiple, thousands, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of incoming requests. And if it would always pause and then do something with that request, this would not be that great. Hence, it uses this event loop concept where in the end it always keeps on running and just executes code when a certain event occurs, so that in general it's always available. And whilst this might still sound like, okay, but if I got two incoming requests, it needs to handle two events. Well, it is super fast in handling these requests, and actually behind the scenes it does some multi-threading by leveraging the operating system. But this event loop is a core thing. You have to keep in mind that Node.js basically has an ongoing loop as long as there are listeners, and create server creates a listener which never stops. But if you eventually were to unregister, and you can do this with process.exit, it would end. And we can see that too. If we go back to our code, and after this line, we type process.exit and execute this function, and we clear our console, and we now repeat node app.js. You see, it's now still running because this function never executed. We had no incoming request yet. But if we now reload this page, localhost 3000, you see we still log that request, but then we're back in a new line in the terminal because now it did quit that process. It didn't before, but now it did. It did quit that process with the help of process exit. Now, typically, you don't call that in your code because you don't want to quit your server. If it quits, people will not be able to reach your web page anymore. But this is important for understanding how this works. Process exit basically hard exited our event loop, and therefore the program shut down because there was no more work to do. Node.js saw that there is no more work to do, and it basically closed the program and gave control back to our terminal here. So this is how we execute such a Node.js file and how we generally create such a server and what Node.js does behind the scenes. Let's see how we can now also work with the request and with the response object we have in that anonymous function here.